The clock on the wall struck 12, each beat vibrating through the floorboards. Elias stood in the center of the living room, his posture rigid. He did not hesitate. He walked to the closet, pulled the suitcase from the back, and dropped it onto the bed with a dull thud. The latch clicked open. He moved to the dresser, his hands working with a rhythmic, mechanical efficiency. He took a shirt, smoothed the fabric against his palm, and folded it into a perfect square. He repeated the motion, again and again. The room was filled with the sound of shifting fabric and the steady, rhythmic ticking of the clock. He moved around the bed, his gaze locked firmly on the suitcase interior. To his left, framed photographs sat on the nightstand, their glass surfaces catching the dim light. He did not turn his head. He did not acknowledge the images. He walked to the bookshelf, his fingers hovering inches from the spines of books they had once read together, but he pulled his hand back as if burned. He turned away, his movements sharp and precise, and returned to the suitcase. He finished the final fold, closed the lid, and latched the suitcase shut. He set the suitcase by the door and walked into the kitchen. The air here was cooler, smelling faintly of roasted beans. On the counter, a half-finished cup of coffee sat in the center of a small, dark ring of condensation. A thin, translucent film had formed over the surface of the liquid, undisturbed by the passage of time. He stood over it, watching the steam long since vanished. He walked past the cup, his footsteps silent on the linoleum. He reached the dining table, a heavy piece of oak that dominated the room. He opened the top drawer. The metal slides groaned, a sharp sound that cut through the silence. He pulled out his passport and the spare key. He laid them side by side on the polished wood surface. They looked small, abandoned. He stood there for a moment, his hands resting on the table edge. He did not reach for a pen. He did not look for paper. There would be no note, no explanation, no final words to justify the departure. He simply turned his back on the table, leaving the documents behind. He walked toward the living room exit, the silence in the apartment, now absolute. Elias reached the threshold of the front door. The wood was cool beneath his palm, a solid barrier between the life he had occupied and the space beyond. He stopped. The silence of the apartment seemed to intensify, gathering in the corners of the room like rising pressure. He stared at the brass handle, his gaze fixed on the small scratches in the metal surface. He reached out. His fingers hovered just inches from the cold, polished curve. A slight tremor started in his right hand, a rhythmic twitching that traveled up his wrist. He held his breath, watching the movement, waiting for the impulse to pass. He did not pull back. He did not turn around to scan the room one last time. He forced his hand to remain steady, fighting the involuntary resistance of his own nerves. After a long, suspended second, the shaking stopped. He curled his fingers around the handle, his grip tightening until his knuckles stood out in sharp relief. He rotated the mechanism. The internal springs groaned under the pressure, a metallic protest that filled the narrow entryway. He held the tension for a heartbeat, then pushed down. The lock clicked. Elias stepped into the corridor. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting rhythmic, strobe-like shadows against the beige walls. He walked toward the elevator, his footsteps muffled by the worn carpet, leaving the apartment door slightly ajar behind him. He pressed the call button. The metal plate was cold, vibrating with the low hum of the building's machinery. When the doors slid open, he stepped inside. The interior was a small, polished steel box that mirrored his presence. He stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on the floor numbers as they began their steady descent. The display flickered from 10 to 9, then 8. He watched his own reflection in the steel panel. His features remained rigid, unreadable, his gaze locked on the shifting digits rather than his own eyes. The elevator slowed, the floor numbers ticking down until they hit the lobby. The doors parted with a soft hiss. He walked out, his stride lengthening as he crossed the marble floor. The lobby doors pushed outward, and he stepped directly into the biting night air. The wind caught him immediately, sharp and sudden against his skin. He turned his collar up, shielding his neck from the chill. He did not look back at the building. Elias reached the street corner. He stood at the edge of the curb, waiting for the signal to change. A taxi pulled to the side, its headlights carving bright, white paths through the dark. He opened the door and slid into the back seat. The interior smelled of leather and stale air. He pulled the door shut, cutting off the wind. As the vehicle pulled away, the engine began a low, rhythmic hum. He leaned his head against the glass. Outside, the city lights began to smear, stretching into long, golden streaks that raced past the window. The heavy, pressurized silence of the apartment was gone, replaced by the mechanical pulse. He kept his gaze fixed forward, toward the dark road ahead.